A man who stopped living, a woman the whole town called a witch, and a 6-year-old girl who burned a pan of biscuits on purpose, just to give two broken people a reason to find each other. Sometimes the smallest hands do the biggest healing, this story reminds us. Grief is not the end of living. Sometimes all it takes is one small, barefooted child asking the right question to bring a person back to life. This is the channel where the West comes alive through stories of quiet courage, unlikely love, and the children who see the truth before any grown-up dares to. If this story warmed something in you, pay it forward. Hit that like, leave a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribe.
The summer of 1883 was a mean one in Powder Creek, Wyoming. Ethan had been up before dawn, but sleep was a stranger to him now. Ever since that night in 1881, when all he could do was stand there with a lantern while the doctor left, there was nothing left but work. He'd mend fences that were perfectly fine and stack hay that was already neat. He would ride his horse, Duke, along the property line, just feeling the animal's slow, tired breaths match his own, just two creatures going through the motions. That July morning, he was hammering a post near the creek, the heat already a heavy blanket on his shoulders. The whole point was to work so hard you couldn't think. Swing the sledgehammer until your mind went quiet, until there was no memory of a smile in a kitchen doorway. He swung again, and then again. A small voice cut through the quiet. "You sure look sad, mister." The sledgehammer stopped halfway up. Ethan turned slow, like a man who isn't sure he can trust his own ears. A little girl was standing there by the open gate. She couldn't have been more than 6, with a mess of coppery red hair and dusty bare feet. She was holding a tin box to her chest with both arms like it was treasure. Her green eyes stared right at him without a single blink. "Did you hear me? I said you look sad." Ethan put the sledgehammer down. "Are you lost, little one?" "No," she said, tilting her head. "Are you?" He didn't have an answer for that. He just picked up his hat and settled it back on his head. "Where is your mama?" "She sent me," the girl said, pointing a finger toward the trees. "She says today might be the day you finally smile." Ethan just stared. "My mama's been watching you with that same fence post for 3 days, and you haven't smiled one time." He stayed quiet. "What is in the box?" he asked. "Medicine," the girl answered, "and biscuits. Mama says biscuits can fix just about anything." She held the tin out to him. "She wants you to have them." He didn't take it. "Who is your mama?" he asked, his voice low. The girl hugged the tin close again, sizing him up. "Her name is Clara," she finally said. "And she is not what people say she is." Those words settled deep in Ethan's chest. "What do they say?" "She is?" he asked gently. The little girl lifted her chin. "They say bad things, but they are liars." She looked him square in the eye. "Are you the kind of man who believes gossip? Or are you the kind who finds things out for himself?" For the first time in 2 years, something that felt like a smile touched Ethan Carter's face. "What is your name?" "Lily." "Well, Lily," he said back to her, "are you coming? The biscuits are getting cold." And with that, she turned and walked right back through the gate, never once doubting he would follow. And he did. Maybe it was because her sureness was something he hadn't felt in a lifetime. Maybe it was just because he was hungry. He told himself it was the biscuits. Lily chattered the whole way as they walked into the cottonwood trees. "We got here in April. Mama fixed the roof all by herself. She is real good at fixing things. She even fixed a bird with a broken wing once. Then it flew away. She says that's how you know you did it right, when what you fixed does not need you anymore." "How long has she been watching me?" "Since the second day," Lily said, not looking back. "She made me promise not to bother you. But she burned the biscuits this morning, and she never does that. I figured it was a sign." "A sign of what?" Lily stopped and turned to him, her face serious. "That she was nervous," she said. "Mama does not get nervous over nothing." Then she led him down a small hill, and he saw the old cabin. It was his grandfather's, a place he hadn't seen in years. The roof was patched with new wood, and bunches of herbs were drying from the porch. A woman was standing there. She must have heard him coming because she was already waiting on the porch. She stood there, straight as a board with her hands folded, watching him walk up without any fuss. Clara Whitmore was not the woman Ethan expected. She was about his age, lean in a way that spoke of hard work and too little food. Her brown hair was pulled back tight, and a simple gray dress, clean but frayed at the cuffs, was all she wore. Her feet were bare against the wood, which made the whole picture feel a lot more honest. She looked at him straight on. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low and steady, "I need to apologize. I told Lily not to go troubling you." "She was not a trouble," he said, and found he meant every word. "She told you her name, and then asked if you were the kind of man who listened to gossip, did not she?" A little frown touched Clara's lips. "That is what I call a trouble." "That is a fair question," Ethan replied. A quiet moment passed between them. Then she stepped aside and held the cabin door open. "Come on in," she offered. "I will make some coffee." The cabin was just one room. It had a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a sleeping pallet in the corner for Lily. A cot for Clara was set against the far wall. Next to it sat an overflowing sewing basket. A piece of colorful fabric was spread on the table, partly cut. The air smelled of dried herbs and something sweet, probably the fresh biscuits. Ethan took a seat as he was raised to do. He set his hat on the edge of the table. Lily placed a tin box between them and popped the lid off. Inside were half a dozen golden brown biscuits and a small bottle of arnica salve. "Your hands," Lily said, pointing. "From fixing the fence?" "Mama saw them." He looked down at his right hand. A blister had broken and scabbed over more than once. Clara put a cup of coffee before him without saying a thing, then took the other chair. For a spell, nobody spoke. Lily just sat on the windowsill, watching them like a hawk. "How long have you been here?" Ethan finally asked. "Since April 4th, Clara said, holding her own cup. "I did not know this land was yours when we came. We were not planning to stay. Lily was sick and the cabin was empty. I only meant to be here 3 days, but the roof held and I thought maybe 1 more week. And now it is July," he stated plainly. She met his gaze without flinching. "I will go if you want me to. I would understand." He picked up a biscuit. It was still warm from the stove. He took a bite, and for a second, nothing else mattered. It was the best thing he had tasted in years. "You are not hurting anything," he said after a moment. "The place was just sitting here empty." A look passed over her face, something more careful than simple relief. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "Mama," Lily piped up from the window, "tell him about your herbs. She grows them for medicine. She can fix a cough or a fever or an upset stomach, or if you cannot sleep at night." Lily paused, looking right at him. "Can you sleep at night, Mr. Carter?" "Lily!" Clara's voice was a clear warning. But Ethan looked at the little girl, and the corner of his mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile. "Not all that well," he admitted. "She will make you something for it," Lily said, pleased with herself. "She's real good at it." He ended up staying for 2 hours that morning, drinking coffee and eating 3 biscuits. He talked more in that short time than he had in the whole last year. They did not talk about anything important, which was the surprising part. They talked about the dry spell and his 4 horses. Lily wanted to know each of their names and what they were like, and he told her. They talked about the south wall of the cabin, which was starting to pull away from the floor. "I can fix that," Ethan said. "It is not a big job." "You do not have to do that," Clara said. "I know," he answered. "I will bring my tools tomorrow." He was halfway across the field before he realized what he had said. Tomorrow. He had said it like it was a sure thing, like he had already decided to come back. He stopped in the tall grass for a long moment, just looking back at the trees that hid the cabin. Then he put his hat back on his head and kept on walking. He came back the next day and the day after that. He told himself it was the wall, then it was a broken window, then a weak board on the porch step. There was always something that needed his attention. Lily was always there to greet him, popping out from the trees as if she had been listening for his footsteps. She was full of questions about his horses or the town. Once she asked if he had ever seen a mountain lion. "Up on the north ridge," he told her. Were you scared? Any man who says he is not scared of a mountain lion is a liar or a fool, he said. Lily thought about that. Mama says the same thing about thunderstorms. Your mama is right. Lily beamed like he had given her a prize. Clara was always more reserved. She was not cold, just careful. She thanked him for his work and brought him water, but she never asked him questions about himself, and he noticed it. On the fourth morning, she was on the porch sewing a little pink dress for Lily. She had her reading glasses on and was so focused she did not hear him until he was right there at the gate. She looked up. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." "Morning," he said, setting his toolbox down. "You do not have to call me that." "Ethan, then." She held up the pink dress for him to see. The fabric was from an old adult-sized garment, but she had cut it down and pieced it together for a child. The patterns matched up perfectly at the seams, a sign of real skill. "She has been wearing the same 2 dresses since we got here. A lady from the church gave me the fabric." "That is fine work," he said. And he meant it. "Thank you," she said, looking down at the dress. He picked up his tools and went to find the next thing to fix. It was on the 6th day that the subject of town came up between them. Lily was inside taking a nap. The afternoon heat was heavy, and Ethan had stopped working to get a drink of water in the shade. Clara brought out a jar of cold mint tea. They sat on the porch steps, watching the heat shimmer across the field. "How long has it been since you went into Powder Creek?" she asked. He took a long, slow drink before he answered. "People talk," she said plainly. It was a fact, not a complaint. "They do," he agreed. "About me," she said. "I am sure you have heard the stories. I am not going to sit here and defend myself to you, Ethan. I am tired of the sound of my own voice doing it. But I need you to know that Lily is mine. Not by blood, but she is mine." "I know," he said, "and Clara." He waited for her to look at him. "I have not been to town in 4 months, and I have never been the kind to listen to gossip. You do not owe me any explanations." She just stared, her jaw tight, like she was waiting for a fight that wasn't coming. "Then why do you keep coming back here?" she asked. He thought for a minute. "Because Lily asked me to," he said. "And because this is the first place in a long, long time where my own head has felt quiet." That felt like I was just passing through. The silence that settled between them was a comfortable one. After a good while, Clara spoke. "You know, she burned my biscuits on purpose that day." Ethan looked over at her. "The morning she went to find you," Clara explained. "I saw her do it, held the pan right over the flame until they were black as coal. Then she looked up at me and said, 'Mama, I reckon we ought to go introduce ourselves to that rancher.'" She paused. "That little girl has her own way of seeing things." "Yeah," Ethan said with a soft chuckle. "I'm starting to see that. She decided you needed us about a week after we got here. I told her it wasn't our place, but she wouldn't hear it." He pictured the little girl at his fence line, dust on her bare feet, asking him if he was the kind of man who found things out for himself. "Smart kid," he said. "Scares me sometimes," Clara admitted. Then in the heavy afternoon heat, Clara Whitmore smiled. It was a small, careful thing, but it was genuine, and Ethan Carter found himself watching it for a moment too long. He turned his eyes back to the pasture, a strange, quiet shift happening somewhere deep inside him. He never said a word about it, but he was back the next morning before the sun was fully up. And the morning after that, 3 good weeks flew by, the way happy times always do. Ethan quit pretending he was there to fix things. He'd just show up, Clara would put on a pot of coffee, and Lily would climb the fence rail to tell him every single thing she'd been thinking. The south wall was patched, the window was in, and the porch step was solid. Sure, there was always more work to do on an old place, but that wasn't why he was there anymore. All 3 of them knew it, and not one of them ever said it out loud. They just fit together without needing a bunch of words. It was Lily who first called the cabin home. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was reporting the weather. She was telling Ethan about a dream and said, "When I woke up, the light from the window looked different than it does at home." She stopped then, her green eyes serious. "This is home now, I think. Don't you think so?" Ethan looked over the little girl's head at Clara. who was studying her coffee cup. "I think," he said, choosing his words with care, "that home is any place you feel safe." Lily considered that. "Then this is home," she declared. "And your ranch is too, I reckon, 'cause I feel safe there." No one could argue with that. But on the 23rd day, the feeling changed. He knew it the moment he walked up. Clara was on the porch, but she wasn't mending clothes. She stood stiff, her arms crossed tight, watching the far road that ran between his land and the Hendersons'. Her whole body had the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. "Clara," he said, coming through the gate. "What is it?" She turned, her jaw set hard. "Someone was on the road last night," she said slowly. "Just watching the cabin." "Could have been anybody." "No," she said. "It was Mrs. Alderman from the town council. I'd know her horse anywhere." Him, really looking at him, like she was measuring his trust. "3 years ago," she began, "when Mary Colton lost her baby, I was the one helping with the birth. It was hard, and the child, it just wasn't meant to be. Nothing could be done." Her voice went brittle. "But because I was in that room, Mrs. Alderman told everyone I had cursed the child. She got 47 signatures on a petition to have me thrown out of the county." The silence between them was thick with injustice. "That's why you left," Ethan finally said. "I didn't leave," she corrected, her voice like flint. "I was pushed. There's a big difference." She looked back toward the road. "And now she's seen me here on your land. She's going to tell everybody." Ethan picked up his toolbox. "Let her," he said, his voice steady. "This is my land, my business. She has no say here." Clara just stared at him, a mix of hope and doubt on her face. "You don't understand what it's like," she said quietly. "When a whole town decides something about you, the truth doesn't matter. Only what they all agree on." Ethan thought about the long, quiet years after his own loss. How folks he'd known his whole life just started looking through him. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know a little something about that." Avoiding Powder Creek, of people he'd known his whole life looking at him like he was a ghost. He understood how a whole town could quietly shut a person out. He went inside and started working on a wall brace. And soon he heard her sit back down, the sound of her needle moving through cloth. That was enough. He was learning that about Clara. She didn't need a man to fix her problems, she just needed him to stay. But the news of Mrs. Alderman's visit to the sheriff came 4 days later, delivered by Pete Dawson from the general store. Pete drove his buckboard out on a Thursday, which was strange enough to pull Ethan from the barn. "Got something you ought to hear before you hear it wrong," Pete said, looking uneasy. "People in town are talking, saying you got Clara Whitmore staying in that east cabin." "I do," Ethan said plainly. Pete blinked, surprised by the directness. "Well," he stammered, "Mrs. Alderman ain't just talking about the old trouble anymore. She's telling folks that the little girl with Clara, that she was taken." Everything inside Ethan went cold and still. "Taken?" he repeated. "She's saying Clara stole her from a family in Cassidy County. Sheriff Briggs is talking about riding out here." Ethan took the letter from old Pete but didn't bother to open it. "Go on," he said. Pete, the store owner, looked uneasy. "Folks in town are talking, Ethan, about the woman out at the eastern cabin. They are saying it is Clara Whitmore." "It is." Pete looked surprised. "Ethan," he started, but Ethan cut him off. "She and her daughter have been there since April in a cabin that was just sitting empty." "I have heard the stories, Pete, and I will tell you the same thing I tell everyone else. She has done no harm on my land. What happened to the Colton baby was a terrible accident, not some curse." Pete twisted his hat in his hands. "It is not just that anymore, Ethan. Mrs. Alderman is telling people that the little girl Lily was taken." The world went silent for Ethan. "Taken?" he repeated. "She is saying Clara stole that child from a family in Cassidy County. Sheriff Briggs is thinking about riding out." Ethan handed the unopened letter back to Pete. "When?" he asked, his voice like stone. "Any day now." Ethan stared down the long, empty road at Pete. "Much obliged," he said, "for coming out yourself." Pete settled his hat back on his head. "I always did like your daddy," he said, "and I always thought what this town did to Clara Whitmore was a crying shame." He picked up his reins. "Sorry I didn't speak up louder back then." As he rode off, Ethan watched him go. Then he saddled Duke and rode east, and he didn't waste any time. Clara was hanging laundry when he came through her gate at a full clip. "What happened?" she asked. No time for greetings. She could read him like a book. He hadn't known that until right then. "Sit down," he told her. "Tell me standing." So he told her everything. The sheriff, the letter, Mrs. Alderman, and what Pete had said. He gave it to her straight. She stood there, a wet shirt clutched in her hands, listening. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Lily was abandoned," she said, her voice flat and hard. It was the voice of someone tired of explaining the truth to folks who refused to hear it. She was 18 months old. It was February. She would have died out there. She dropped the shirt in the basket. "I took her to the county office. I told them exactly where I found her. They told me to bring her back in 3 days. Her jaw went tight. "I went back in 3 days. The man I spoke with was gone. The new clerk had no record of it. He told me if I left her, she'd be sent to the state orphanage. He said she'd likely be separated from any family she had left." There was a pause. She was 18 months old and had already learned that crying didn't bring nobody. Clara's voice broke just a little on that, then went firm again. "So, I kept her." Ethan didn't say a thing. He just listened. "I've tried twice since then to find her people. Hired a man in Cassidy to check the records. He found nothing. There's no family in Cassidy looking for that little girl, Ethan." She looked him dead in the eye. "Whatever that woman is saying, it ain't the truth." "I believe you," he said. The words seemed to hit her like a physical thing. "You don't have to," she started. He waited until she looked right at him again. "Clara, I believe you." She just stood there for a second, her hands empty, the laundry basket at her feet. He saw her eyes shine with tears she refused to let fall. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "Nothing yet," he said. "Not till Briggs shows his face. Pete said he's waiting to hear back from Cassidy. If there's no family and no record, he's got nothing to act on." "But you should write it all down," he said. "The date, the road, the clerk's name, everything." "I already have," she said softly. "I wrote it all down 2 years ago, and I kept it." He just looked at her. "Because I knew," she said. "I knew someday someone would come." The thought of her, all alone, writing down the most important things she'd ever done just to defend it one day, hit him hard. He had to look away. "Good," he said. "Keep it handy." Just then, Lily came around the side of the cabin. Her hair was full of cottonwood fluff, and she was holding something carefully in her hands. "I found a frog," she announced. "A big one. Want to see?" Clara looked at her little girl, and the fierce light in her eyes softened into something else. It was a love so big and open that Ethan had to look away from that, too. "I would love to see your frog, sweet girl," Clara said. Her voice was steady and calm, as if the world wasn't trying to fall down around them. Ethan thought, "This woman is tougher than any man I've ever known." And right after that, another thought came unwanted. "I am in a whole world of trouble." He stayed for supper. He hadn't planned on it, but Lily asked him to, and he couldn't find a good reason to say no. Clara made salt pork and cornbread. She didn't say a word about him staying, just set a third plate on the table. The three of them sat in the dimming light while Lily told them all about the frog. She had named him and was worried about his new home. "I think," Clara said with a serious face, "that frogs are happiest out in the wild." "But what if he gets lonely?" Lily asked. "Frogs don't get lonely," Ethan said. Lily gave him a doubtful look. "How do you know?" "Because they have a whole pond full of other frogs." You don't have a whole pond full of other people, Lily shot back. And you were lonely. The little cabin went dead quiet. Clara stared at her plate. Ethan just looked at the little girl who was looking right back at him. She wasn't being mean, just stating the truth as she saw it. "That's fair," he finally said. "So maybe the frog is lonely too," Lily said, satisfied. "I'll put him back tomorrow, but I want him to sleep inside tonight so he knows someone noticed him." A small sound escaped Clara, something like a hidden laugh. Ethan looked at her, and she looked back at him. In that one look over the child's head, something real and new passed between them. He was the one who looked away first. He rode home in the dark, Duke's hooves quiet on the dry dirt. He thought about a woman who wrote down the truth 2 years ago because she knew nobody would believe her. He thought about a little girl who brought a frog inside so it would feel seen. He hadn't felt seen in 2 years. He didn't want to be. Being seen meant being the man whose wife and son were gone. He just wanted to be a ghost. But sitting at that table with that little girl's honest words and that woman's quiet strength, he started to feel like a person again. Not just a sad story, but a man. He was crossing the east field when he heard horses on the main road. He pulled Duke up. 2 riders moving slow, coming from town. He watched through the trees as they passed. The moonlight glinted off a sheriff's star on the taller man's chest. Briggs hadn't waited for that letter after all. Ethan spun Duke around and rode back hard. He pushed the horse so fast its breath came in ragged bursts by the time he saw the lamplight in Clara's window. She was still awake. He came through the gate so quick she was at the door before he was even off his horse. She took one look at his face. "How many?" she asked. "2. Briggs and someone else. They're on the road, moving slow." Without a word, Clara went back inside. He tied Duke to the porch and followed. She was at the cot, pulling a notebook from under the mattress. It was the one she'd told him about. 2 years of truth. She held it to her chest and looked at him. "Lily's asleep," she whispered. "Good. Let her be. Ethan," she said, her voice low. "If he has papers." "He doesn't," he said, his own voice steady as a rock. "Pete told me Briggs was waiting. He ain't got nothing official. And without it, he can't take a child. That's the law." "The law," Clara repeated. The way she said it told him everything he needed to know about what the law had ever done for her. He understood. "I'm staying tonight," he said. She started to protest. "I'll sleep on the porch," he said, and that was the end of it. "Don't you argue with me on this." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. "He won't come tonight," she said, almost to herself. "He'll want the sun up. He'll want an audience." "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "That's what I figured, too." And she was right. The night passed quietly. Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap and Duke sleeping by the steps. There were no riders, no torches, just the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. Sometime before dawn, the door creaked open. Clara came out with 2 cups of coffee, handed him one, and sat on the top step. They drank in that gray, silent light, and it was more than enough. When Lily woke up and saw Ethan, she announced, "I knew you would stay. The frog told me." "The frog told you?" Ethan asked, a small smile touching his face. "I asked him before I went to sleep," Lily said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "and he didn't say no." Clara covered her mouth, her tired eyes shining. "That's not how frogs work," Ethan said gently. "That's not how you know," Lily corrected him, completely certain. He looked at Clara, who looked back at him. And for a moment, despite Sheriff Briggs and Mrs. Alderman and all the trouble coming their way, he thought maybe the kid was right. Well, trouble was coming, and Ethan Carter almost smiled. Sheriff Briggs showed up that afternoon, but he didn't bring 2 riders. He brought a whole 6 of them. Ethan was out on the north side of the cabin fixing a loose board when he heard the horses. It was a slow, heavy sound. He put his hammer down and came around front just as they rode through his gate. Sheriff Nolan Briggs was a big man who wore his authority plain on his face. He led the pack. Behind him were 2 deputies and 3 other fellows from town, and right there with them, sitting tall in her saddle like a queen, was Mrs. Alderman. Ethan walked to the middle of the yard and planted his feet. The cabin door opened and Clara came to stand beside him. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes locked on Briggs. "Ethan," the sheriff said, reining in his horse. "Seems to me you're a long way from your front porch." "This is my property," Ethan said flatly. "So this is my front porch." Briggs glanced at Clara, then back to Ethan. "We've had a complaint," he said, "about the welfare of a child you're keeping here." "Her name is Lily," Clara said, her voice steady as a rock. "She's 6 years old and she is my daughter." Mrs. Alderman made a little noise in her throat, but said nothing. "That's what we're here to find out," Briggs said. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I have a statement from a Mrs. Price over in Cassidy County. Says a woman who looks a lot like you took a child from her neighbor's yard back in the winter of 1880. The air got real thick. "Let me see that paper," Ethan said. Briggs didn't move. "I said, let me see it." Ethan's voice went low and quiet, the kind of tone that stubborn cattle understand right away. Briggs rode a step closer and handed it over. Ethan unfolded it and read with Clara looking over his shoulder. He could feel the exact moment she understood what it said. "This is just a statement, Sheriff. It's not a warrant from a judge. It's enough to ask some questions." "It's a piece of paper," Ethan said, holding it up. "It says a woman with brown hair. It doesn't name Clara. It doesn't name Lily. You rode all the way out here with 6 men on a Saturday for a piece of town gossip?" A flicker of something crossed the sheriff's face. It wasn't guilt. It was the look of a man who knows he's gone too far but has too many eyes on him to turn back now. "The child's welfare," he started. "Is not in question," Ethan cut him off. "I've seen that little girl every single day for a month. She's fed, she's clothed, and she is loved. You want to worry about welfare? Go check on the Hendricks place, where those boys ain't seen new boots in 2 years. He took a step forward. "You don't come on my land with gossip dressed up as the law." "Ethan?" Briggs' voice was low now, trying to sound reasonable, but coming out like a threat. "I've known you a long time. I know what you've been through. But this woman, she has a history." "What I'm doing here," Ethan said, letting the silence hang for a moment, "is my own business." Mrs. Alderman spurred her horse forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice full of church fundraiser authority, "that woman put a curse on an innocent child. She brought death into a good family's home." "A responsibility to what?" Clara's voice cut through the air. Everyone turned to look at her as she stepped right past Ethan. She stopped in the yard and looked straight up at Mrs. Alderman on her high horse. Her voice was quiet, but clear as a bell. "To what, exactly, Mrs. Alderman?" "I was at the Colton house because Mary Colton begged me to be there. I was there for 11 hours and I did everything I knew to do. The baby died because sometimes babies just die. It has nothing to do with curses or stories you tell yourself to make the world feel right." She paused. "I know you were their friend. I know you were grieving. But so was I. And you used your grief to ruin my name." The yard was dead silent. Mrs. Alderman's face was hard as stone, but her eyes showed a hint of discomfort. "The child," she said stiffly, "ought to be with a proper family." "She is with a proper family," Clara said. "She calls me Mama. If you try to take her from me, you'll have to explain to a 6-year-old girl why the people meant to protect her are the ones tearing her world apart." Briggs looked from one woman to the other. He had his hand on his saddle, but he hadn't made a move toward the cabin. He was watching Ethan. And Ethan was standing there in a way that made it plain what would happen if anyone tried to cross that yard. "I'll need to speak with the girl," Briggs finally said. "No," Ethan said. "Sheriff, she's 6 years old. She's inside and she has no idea you're even here. You want to talk to her? You come back with an order signed by a judge." He held the paper out. After a long moment, Briggs rode forward and snatched it back. "Until then, you're on my land without cause. I'd appreciate it if y'all would leave." Briggs just sat there on his horse, doing the math in his head. He was weighing the law, his pride, and the man standing in front of him. Finally, he turned his horse. "This ain't over," he said quietly to Ethan. It sounded less like a threat and more like a fact. "I know," Ethan said. They all rode out with Mrs. Alderman last, her back ramrod straight. When the sound of the horses was gone, the cabin door creaked open. Lily stood there in her bare feet, her red hair a mess, holding a little frog in her hands. "Were those bad people?" she asked. "They're people who are scared of things they don't understand," Ethan said. Lily thought about that. "That's almost the same thing," she said. And he couldn't argue with her. Later that night, long after Lily was asleep, Ethan sat with Clara at the table. She had a notebook, and she told him the whole story again from the very beginning. Not because he didn't believe her, but because he needed to know it backwards and forwards. When she was done, she looked down at the table. "For 3 years, I've waited for someone to hear that story and not look at me with doubt in their eyes." "How's it feel?" he asked. She looked up at him. "Like I just put down something heavy I didn't even know I was still carrying." He pushed the notebook back toward her. "Keep this close," he said. "We're going to need it." She nodded. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft and serious, "whatever happens, you don't have to be in this fight. It's not yours." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said finally, "but I'm making it mine." She just looked at him, a brightness in her eyes, and this time she let it stay. He rode home in the dark. The next 4 days were quiet, the kind of unnatural quiet that tells you a storm is brewing. He went to the cabin each morning. He and Clara never spoke Briggs's name, but they were both listening for trouble in the wind. Lily, who saw everything, started taking her frog to bed again, and he knew not to ask. On the 5th day, he got there at sunup and reined in his horse. A single word was painted on the old hayshed in big black letters, the paint still wet and dripping. And swinging from a beam right below it was a rope tied in a hangman's knot. The bottom dropped out of his stomach. He just sat there a moment, getting his hands steady, then walked to the cabin. Clara turned from the stove, read his face, and knew. "What is it?" "Do not let Lily go outside this morning," he said. And then he told her. She went still the way she did when things were truly bad. Her eyes looked inward, calculating. When they came back to him, they were sharp and certain. "I came right to you," he said. She did not see it. "We have to leave," Clara said. "No," Ethan answered, and his voice was different. It was something harder than firm, something that had been waiting 2 long years to finally break through his grief. "We are not leaving," he said. "You will not take that little girl and run just because some coward with a paint bucket snuck out here in the dark. That is exactly what they want. If we go, they win. You have spent 3 years losing to folks who were dead wrong about you. I am not going to let that happen again." "There is a child in this," she said, her voice tight. "I know there is," he said. "That is precisely why we are not running." They could hear the small sound of Lily turning in her sleep. Clara's face softened, letting a wall down he had never seen fall before. "She told me last week," Clara whispered, "that she wants to plant a garden here come spring. Asked if she could have her own row." Ethan said nothing. "She has never asked for something that takes that long," Clara said. "Something you have to stay in one place for." She looked him dead in the eye. "She thinks we are staying." "We are staying," he said. "You cannot promise that." "I just did," he replied. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her. "I am going into town," he said. "This morning. I have been quiet for months, letting them tell the story. That stops today. And tomorrow," he added, "is Sunday." Clara's eyes sharpened. "Sunday. The whole town will be at the church," he said. "Every last person who signed that paper, who gossiped, who made up their mind about you. I'm going to walk right in there. Ethan, if you do that, they will turn on you, too. You have a ranch, a reputation. Clara, he said, waiting for her to stop. What do you think I have been doing out here for 2 years? None of it has meant anything. He held her gaze. You know what has meant something? This cabin, Lily and her questions. You. You mean something. And I will not sit here and wait to see what Nolan Briggs decides to do about it. You are going to start a fight, she said. Probably, he agreed. Do not go alone. I will take Pete Dawson. He is not afraid to speak his mind. He reached across the table, putting his hand over hers. We are not leaving, he said quietly, and they are not taking her. She turned her hand over, and her fingers closed around his. I believe you, she said. You. It was a mean and ugly thing. Someone had come in the dead of night, hung a noose from a shed beam, and painted a hateful word on the wall. This wasn't just for him, it was for Clara. For 3 long years, the town had made her an outcast for a single act of kindness. Ethan Carter decided that was long enough. This is a story about a good man standing up to a whole town full of wrong. It is about having the courage to speak the truth when no one wants to listen. Before the sun was even fully up, Ethan was knocking on Pete Dawson's door. Pete answered, holding a coffee cup, sleep still in his eyes. I need you at the church on Sunday, Ethan said straight out. Pete looked at him, then stepped back. Come on in, he said. I'll get more coffee going. At Pete's kitchen table, Ethan laid out the whole ugly story. He talked about the sheriff, the 6 riders, and the terrible sight in the shed. Pete listened, not saying a word until Ethan was finished. You know the kind of trouble you're stirring up, Pete said. It was not a question. Briggs will be furious. Mrs. Alderman will cause a scene. I'm counting on it, Ethan replied. There are folks in that church, Pete said, turning his cup, who made up their minds about Clara Whitmore years ago. You're not just asking them to change their minds. You're asking them to admit they were flat out wrong. For some people, that is the hardest thing in the world to do. I know, Ethan said. And you're still going? I'm still going. Pete gave a slow final nod, the kind of nod that means there is nothing more to say. All right then, I will be there. After that, Ethan rode into Powder Creek. He tied his horse outside the hardware store and walked right down the main street. You cannot sneak into a town this small. Everyone sees you the second you arrive. He bought his supplies, a few nails, and some rope to replace the one he had already burned. He heard Mrs. Alderman's voice behind him at the counter. Mr. Carter. He turned to face her. I want you to know, she said, her voice low and proper, that what happened was not personal. It was about community standards. Someone hung a noose in my shed, Ethan said, his voice quiet but clear. Her eyes widened just a bit. I beg your pardon. Someone did, he repeated, looking right at her. They felt they had permission to do it. I want you to think hard on where that permission came from. Her chin shot up. That woman is a danger to us all. That woman, Ethan's voice went cold as a river stone, pulled a child, just 18 months old, from a winter road and saved her life when nobody else would. That is all she did, and this town has made her pay for it every single day. He picked up his package. I will see you in church on Sunday, Mrs. Alderman. He walked out, his hands steady as could be. When he got back, he told Clara everything. You told her you would see her Sunday? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I did. Let her tell the whole town. I want them all there. You want an audience, she realized. I want every person who ever whispered a story about you to be in that room when they finally hear the truth. He looked her right in the eye. Clara, I want you to come with me. Ethan, I cannot walk in there. Those people need to see you, he insisted. Not me talking about you. They need to see you standing tall. You told me you were pushed out of that town. It is time to walk back in. Bring Lily." "They will say things in front of her," she worried. "Let them," he said, his voice sure. "Lily is 6 years old. She already knows some folks are afraid of things they do not understand. Let her see what it looks like when you do not run from them." He could see the fight in her, the instinct to stay hidden warring with the need to be free. "I will be right next to you the entire time," he promised. "And Pete Dawson will be there, too." She turned from the window, her eyes shining with a fear she was determined to beat. "If Lily gets scared, we leave," she said. "The second she's scared, we're gone," he agreed. "All right," she said softly. "All right." Sunday came too fast, the way hard days do. Ethan arrived at the cabin to find Lily already dressed in a little pink dress, looking serious. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked. "We're going to church, sweetheart," Ethan told her. Clara stood in the doorway, wearing her best dark blue dress. It was too warm for July, but it was dignified. She looked like exactly what she was, a good woman who was done acting like she had something to be ashamed of. "Will they have singing?" Lily asked. "I bet they will," Ethan smiled. "I like singing," she declared, and she took his hand on one side and her mother's on the other. The church was packed. Word had gotten around just like he'd hoped. Pete was waiting for them on the steps. When he saw them, he stood up straighter and took off his hat. He nodded to Clara with a deep and deliberate respect that the whole town could see. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Glad to see you here." "Thank you, Pete," she answered, her voice soft but steady. As they walked inside, a hush fell over the congregation. It moved like a wave from the back of the church to the front as every head turned to watch them. The room was almost completely silent by the time they reached their seats. Ethan led them to the third row from the front, right in plain sight of everyone. Clara sat beside him, and Lily sat beside her mother. The little girl looked around at all the staring faces. Then she leaned over to Ethan and whispered in a voice loud enough for half the church to hear, "There are a lot of people here." "Yes, there are," he answered, just as loud. Reverend Miles walked to the pulpit, paused for just a second when he saw them, and then started the service. Lily sang along with the hymns, her little voice clear and sweet, and not caring who heard it. The sermon was about the sin of judgment. The Reverend's eyes kept finding their way to the third pew, and each time they did, his voice seemed to get a little bit stronger. Then the service was interrupted. Sheriff Briggs stood up. Right after the sermon, when the Reverend paused for announcements, Briggs stood up. He was a big man, and he turned to face the room instead of the preacher. Everyone knew what that meant. "I think most of you know why this church is full today," he said, his voice calm and used to being in charge. "There is a community matter that needs to be addressed." Then Ethan stood up. A single gasp went through the room. Briggs stopped talking. Ethan was not as big as Briggs, but he stood like a man who had decided he would not be moved. "I would like to say something first," Ethan said, not asking for permission. To his credit, Reverend Miles said, "Go ahead, Ethan." Briggs sat down slow, his eyes fixed on Ethan, his face unreadable, but he sat. Ethan looked out at the faces he had known his whole life. For 2 years he'd been a ghost, lost in his grief, but not anymore. He spoke to the quiet church. 3 years back, a woman named Clara Whitmore was with Mary Colton when her baby was born and passed on. Clara fought for 11 hours to save that child, and for her trouble, this town called her a witch and ran her clean out of the county. She left because she was tired and alone, and not a single soul stood up to say it was wrong. Well, I am standing up now. I know I am late, and for that, I am truly sorry. That same woman, he said, found a little girl left on a winter road in 1880. She kept that child alive when no one else would. That girl is right there beside her, in a pink dress Clara made from cloth she saved for 2 years. He stared right at Mrs. Alderman. "You want to talk about a child's well-being? Lily has never been hungry, or cold, or for one single day felt unwanted. Can every person in this room say the same about their own children? A heavy silence filled the air. The Reverend finally said, "Let her speak." All eyes turned to Clara. She sat still for a moment, gathering a strength that had been growing for 3 long years. Then she stood, and Lily's small hand found hers. Clara faced the crowd, her voice steady. "I am not here for your forgiveness. I made peace long ago with what you think of me. I came here today for my daughter. I wanted to show her that you can face down a place that hurt you, that you do not have to vanish because folks made up their minds about you. She once asked me why we never stayed put. I told her it was just practical. She is only 6 years old, so she believed it. The truth is I was running scared of this very room, but I will not let my daughter grow up watching me be afraid." That was when Mary Colton's sister Ruth got to her feet 4 rows back. Her voice shook, but she pushed on. "I need to say something about my sister. Clara was with her that whole night. I was there. I saw it. She never quit trying. When it was over, she just sat on the floor and cried. Later, I told Mary what folks were whispering. Mary said it was all lies, that Clara did everything humanly possible." Ruth sat down, her voice trembling. "I should have said this 3 years ago. I am saying it now." After that, something in the room had shifted. Old stories die hard, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Mrs. Alderman remained quiet for the rest of the service. She was one of the first to leave, but she waited on the church steps. When Ethan, Clara, and Lily came out, she stood right in their path. She looked straight at Lily, whose green eyes stared right back. "That is a fine dress," Mrs. Alderman said. "My mama made it," Lily replied proudly. "From cloth she was saving." Mrs. Alderman's jaw tightened. "I know. I heard." Then she walked away without another word. It was not an apology, not even close, but it was the first time in 3 years that she had not looked at Clara's child with condemnation. Pete came to Ethan's side. "That is all you will get from her," he said. "It is enough for today," Ethan replied. A moment later, Lily asked for a lemonade from Pete's store. "First one is on the house," Pete declared, and the little girl's face lit up. As she pulled Pete toward his store, Ethan and Clara followed behind. For a second, it felt like they might actually belong there, but the feeling did not last. Back at their cabin, a paper was nailed to the door. Ethan took it down before Clara could. It was a legal notice filed that very morning in the county clerk's office. Nolan Briggs was demanding an emergency hearing to take Lily away from Clara. The hearing was set for Thursday, just 4 days away. Clara read the paper over his shoulder. "He filed this before church," she whispered. "Yes," Ethan said. "He knew we were coming." "Thursday," she said again. 4 days. "For what?" Ethan tucked the notice in his pocket. "For me to ride to Cassidy tonight. I will bring back the clerk who was working in February of 1880. Clara stared. "You do not even know if he is still there." "I know his name," he answered. "You wrote it down for me." She looked at him, her eyes full of something more than just thanks. "That is a 2-day ride." "Then I best be leaving," he said as Lily's voice called from inside. Clara looked from the door back to Ethan. "Come back," she said. Her voice was not a request, but a statement of need. "Come back to us." He met her gaze. "I will." He saddled his horse and rode south as the sun went down. A light came on in the cabin window behind him, a steady beacon in the dusk. He did not look back. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan Carter had a purpose. He rode straight through the night, with Clara's words, "Come back to us," echoing in his mind. He reached Cassidy the next morning, covered in 60 miles of dust and a look on his face that said he was there on serious business and would not be turned away. "I am looking for a clerk," Ethan said. "A man named Harold Fitch. He would have been on duty in February of 1880. The man behind the counter studied him. "Harold retired 2 years ago. Lives out on Miller Road about 3 miles east of here." In minutes, Ethan was there. A dog announced his arrival from a ways off. Harold Fitch, a man in his 60s, came to the door. "You look like a man carrying a heavy load," he said. I need your memory, Ethan said. About a woman named Clara Whitmore. She came to your office in February of 1880 with an abandoned child, a little girl with red hair. Harold Fitch went completely still. Then he said, "Come inside." He remembered. He remembered every single detail. She did everything right, Harold said, sitting at his kitchen table. She reported it properly, gave me every detail she had. I told her to come back in 3 days. He just shook his head. A family matter pulled me away that week. When she returned, I was gone. The fellow filling in for me was temporary. He didn't know a thing about her paperwork. By the time I was back, the woman and the child had vanished. I should have found her. I knew it right then, but the county had no official complaint. No family was searching, and the little girl was not in the system. It was just easier to let it go. He looked right at Ethan. "Is that little girl okay?" "She is fine," Ethan said. "She's healthy and she is loved. She calls Clara her mama and has for 4 years. But in 4 days, a hearing in Powder Creek could tear them apart." Harold Fitch sat there in silence for a good long while. "What is it you need from me?" he finally asked. "I need you to ride back with me," Ethan said, "and tell a judge exactly what you just told me." Harold glanced out his window at his garden and his dog. "Give me 20 minutes to pack," he said. They rode hard, pushing the horses but keeping them sound, and made it back to Powder Creek with less than a day to spare. Ethan headed straight for the cabin. Lily shot off the porch like a cannonball the second he was through the gate. She latched onto his leg with all the force of a worried child, finally letting go of her fear. "You are back," she mumbled into his pants. "I said I would be," he answered, resting a hand on her head. She pulled back and looked up at him, her green eyes dead serious. "Mama did not sleep," she said. "She tried to fool me, but she was awake." "I know," he said softly. "She just kept her eyes on the road." "I know, darling." Clara was on the porch then, looking at him the same way she had been looking at that empty road. Then her gaze drifted past him to Harold Fitch, sitting on his horse by the gate. He saw the question and the cautious hope dawn on her face. "Clara," he said, "this here is Harold Fitch. He was the county clerk back in Cassidy in February of 1880. The blood drained from her face. Mr. Fitch tipped his hat. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I owe you a mighty big apology. I plan to start making it right in that courtroom tomorrow." Clara just stared at the man, her jaw tight. "You remember," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Every last detail," he said. "I'm sorry it took so long." She gave one slow, deliberate nod, then turned and went inside, the door not quite closing behind her. Ethan gave Duke's reins to Harold and went in after her. She was standing at the stove, her back to him, knuckles white from gripping the edge. Her shoulders were trembling from the strain of holding everything inside. He stood there for a moment in the quiet. "3 years," she said, and her voice broke clean in two. "For 3 years, I have told my story, and not a single soul with any power believed me." "I know," he said. "I wrote it all down," she said, the tears finally coming quiet and small. "I wrote down every little thing because I knew this day would come. I have been terrified of this moment for so long. And now," she paused, "now a man is sitting outside my home who remembers it all." "Yes," Ethan said, "he does." She turned to face him, her cheeks wet but her eyes perfectly clear. "How did you know he would still be there?" she asked. "I did not know," he said honestly. "I just knew you wrote his name in your journal. And I know you do not write things down if you do not believe they are the God's honest truth." She looked at him then. All her walls were gone. Every defense she had was just gone. It was the way you look at someone when there are no more reasons left to hide. "Ethan," she whispered. "Yeah," he said back. She reached up and put her hand right on his jaw, like she was checking to see if he was real. He stood perfectly still, then covered her hand with his own, holding it there. They stayed that way for a long moment, saying everything without a single word. Then Lily came in from the yard. "Mr. Fitch wants to know where he ought to put the horses." And just like that, the world came back into focus. The hearing was Thursday morning at 9. Judge Caleb Morrison had come down from the county seat, which meant someone had made sure this was handled right. The judge was a man in his 60s who looked like he had heard every fool's story in the territory and had no patience for injustice. The courtroom was just the back of the land office, the biggest room in town that was not a saloon, and it was full. Ethan was not expecting a crowd, but folks were packed in tight, standing along the walls. He saw Pete near the front and Ruth Hensley, and a dozen other faces he knew and some he did not. He even saw Mrs. Alderman sitting in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead. Up front stood Briggs with a slick lawyer from Cheyenne, both looking mighty sure of themselves. Ethan sat with Clara, watching her steady hands beside her open journal. The lawyer laid out his smooth case, saying Clara had no right to Lily. You could feel folks believing him. Then the judge looked over. "I hear there's a witness." Harold Fitch, the retired county clerk, stood up. He was not a man for speeches, just facts. He told of Clara coming to his office with the child and filing a report right before he was called away on family business. He admitted he failed his duty by not following up. The lawyer saw his chance. "And you have no proof of this?" Harold shook his head. The county lost the file, but she kept her own record. All eyes went to the journal. Clara opened it. Her voice was steady and clear. "I wrote it all down. The date, the clerk's name, and what the next man told me about that orphanage." She met the judge's gaze. "I knew this day might come." Then Harold held up a paper. "They found it, misfiled. Here is the report Clara filed in 1880. The judge read the paper, and the quiet in the room said it all. The fight just drained right out of Briggs. He looked from his lawyer to Clara. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I withdraw the petition." The room breathed out. The judge slammed his folder shut. "The matter is closed. Lily stays with Clara Whitmore." He added, "Let the record show Miss Whitmore acted with more integrity than the county that failed her." Court was adjourned. The room erupted, but Clara just sat for a moment, letting it wash over her. Pete appeared. "She's outside." Clara was gone in a flash. Ethan followed into the sunlight and saw her on the courthouse steps, on her knees, holding Lily tight. The little girl's arms were wrapped around her neck. Ruth Hensley stood nearby, looking worn but honest. "I should have spoken up sooner," she told Ethan. "No," he said. "You spoke when you got sick of being quiet. There is a difference." He looked at Clara and Lily. And that is what mattered. Ethan stood in the sun, watching a family made whole again in Powder Creek. The air was filled with low talk and the sound of horses shifting their weight. It wasn't a mean sound, just folks wrestling with the truth they had gotten wrong for a long while. Mrs. Alderman came walking past Ethan on the steps, then stopped. He met her gaze. She looked down at Clara and Lily, who were huddled together on the bottom step. After a long moment, a look crossed her face he had never seen before. Something that might have been grief if no one was watching. She spoke without looking at him. "The Colton baby is in the church cemetery. I sit with him on Thursdays. I reckon for 3 years it was easier to blame someone else than to blame the Almighty." She paused. "That is not an apology." "No, ma'am," Ethan said. "It's not." She nodded as if she needed to hear him say it. "Clara Whitmore sews a fine seam," she said. "I remember her work. My granddaughter needs a dress for the church social in September." Then she walked away. Ethan watched her go, feeling something big and heavy shift inside him. It was not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was something in the same county. From behind him, Lily's voice piped up. "Ethan, did we win?" He turned to see her standing eye level with him on the step, Clara's hand resting on her back. "Yeah," he said. "We won." Lily gave a satisfied nod. "I told the frog we would." He was not worried. The weeks that followed felt different, like setting down a heavy saddle you did not know you were still carrying. You did not feel lighter, just more like yourself. Clara opened her sewing business for real, clearing out the front room for her work. She hung a little sign on the gatepost she had painted herself. Within 2 weeks, she had 3 orders. The week after, it was 7. One morning, Ethan showed up with lumber from his barn and started building her a proper cutting table. "You did not have to do that," she said from the doorway. "I know," he said, not looking up from his work. They spent the next 3 hours working in the same room without a word, which was the best kind of company. Lily decided to plant her garden on a Saturday in August. It was late in the season, but she had strong opinions about tomatoes and was not waiting for spring. She told Ethan she needed 1 row, but that number grew to 4 once she revealed all the seeds she had. "You said 1 row," Ethan reminded her. "I said I wanted my own row," Lily replied, dead serious from her spot in the dirt. "I did not say that was all the rows." He knelt beside her. "Well, that is a fine point. Mama says to be precise." She pushed a seed into the soil. "Think the tomatoes will grow before winter?" "Probably not this year," he said honestly. "But they might." She glanced at him. "But we will be here in the spring to plant more, right?" Her voice tried to be casual, but she was 6 years old and understood things she should not have to. She needed to hear it plain. "Right," he said. He looked up and saw Clara watching them from the cabin doorway, a bolt of blue fabric over her arm. She was just standing there, taking a break from her sewing. She had a look on her face that had become familiar to him, the one she wore when all the armor was gone. It was just Clara, looking at something she cared about with her whole heart. He met her eyes across the yard, and she gave him a real smile, a full and unguarded smile that warmed him from 20 feet away. He stood and walked over to her. She waited in the doorway as he approached. "You have dirt on your face," she said. "It is part of the job," he replied. She reached up to brush it away, and he caught her hand, holding it to his cheek. "Clara," he started. "Do not make it complicated," she said softly. "You do not have to line up your words so careful for me." He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to stay, not just on the land. I want to stay here with you and with Lily. I want to stop pretending I'm going home when I leave, because this is the only place that has felt like home in a long, long time." Clara's jaw was tight, her eyes shining. "I know what these last few months have been," she said. "I know that kind of danger can make feelings seem bigger than they are." "Clara." He held her gaze, his voice steady and true. "I was coming to this cabin every morning for 3 months before any of that trouble started. I came because I wanted to be here, because of you and because of Lily. This is the first place that has felt like I am building something instead of just maintaining it. You asked me once why I kept coming back," he said. "That is the whole answer." She was quiet for a moment. "I have a past in this county," she finally said. "No matter where I go, that story seems to get there before I do." "I know all that," he said. "I was in the room when they decided it, and I am still here." She looked down at their joined hands. "Lily will want to name our horses," she said. He thought of his 4 geldings, all with names they had had for years. "She can rename them," he said. Clara laughed, a sudden, real sound that changed her whole face. He thought he could work a lifetime just to hear that sound again. "She's going to name them something terrible," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She looked up at him, her eyes a little wet at the corners, but her smile bright and sure. She looked completely like herself. "Okay," she said, "just that one plain word." "Okay," he said back. From the garden, Lily's voice called out, "I need someone to hold the measuring string. It keeps moving." They looked at each other. Clara stepped off the porch first, and he followed her into the sunlight. They knelt in the dirt on either side of Lily's growing tomato empire. The string pulled tight between them while Lily gave orders from the middle, telling them to hold it steady. Ethan looked at Clara over the string, and she looked back. Hard days were surely still ahead, but here they were. The story was not finished, but the 3 of them were in the dirt together, holding the string straight. For 2 years, Ethan Carter had not known what he was staying for. Now he felt the answer settle in him, quiet and complete, as if it had been there all along. He was not staying because the trouble was over or because the town had changed. He stayed because he had seen a woman who was pushed down, who stood up for the truth, who kept a child safe, and who walked right back into the town that had turned her out. He understood that a woman with that kind of courage deserved to have someone standing with her. He was going to be that someone. "Do not let it go slack," Lily commanded. "We have got it, sweetheart," Clara answered. The strings stayed straight, the seeds were in the earth, and the summer held them close. For the first time in 2 years, Ethan Carter smiled. Not just the start of one, but the whole thing. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.